Alex, welcome to New Zealand. It's good to have you here. Let's get straight into it. You've written a book that suggests that there's a link between cannabis, psychotic episodes, and violence.
Yes.
Some say the leap is too far. What do you say to that?
So there's no question that cannabis can cause transient psychotic episodes. That's a diagnosis in the medical literature. And frankly, it's something that a lot of users have experienced at least one time. Although they probably don't use the word psychosis to describe it, having sort of severe anxiety or paranoid thoughts that you might leave the party and you just have to spend the night, in your bedroom hoping that you'll feel better. I think that's not an uncommon experience for some people who use this drug regularly. Now, as the connection between psychosis and violence, that's also quite clear in the literature, unfortunately. And I want to be clear when we talk about this, I don't want to stigmatize people with severe mental illness. If those people are taking their medicine, if they're taking care of themselves, their risk of violence isn't that high. But when they're off their medicine and if they're taking recreational drugs, especially a drug like cannabis, which can cause paranoia, even in healthy people, the risk is quite high.
Are we talking about medicinal cannabis as well?
Yes, there really is no difference between medicinal and recreational cannabis. That's the same plant, it's the same drug. There is a difference between CBD and THC. CBD is something that many people may have heard of, and that in the US you can buy it in many pharmacies. CBD is not really psychoactive, it doesn't get people high. THC is the chemical in cannabis that gets people high, and both quote-unquote medical and recreational cannabis have THC in them.
A research associate professor from the Christchurch study said about this link, the attempt to link cannabis use to violence via psychotic illness is tenuous at best.
I would say it's more than tenuous. I wouldn't necessarily say it's proven. I would say there's very strong evidence that psychotic episodes can cause violence, and there's very strong evidence that cannabis can cause temporary psychosis. I would say both those things are proven. Now, you might say, okay, but maybe those people who were smoking would have become psychotic anyway at that time and would have committed the same violent act that they would have. But at some point, when you have sort of a causal, you have a causal connection from A to B, you have a causal connection from A to C, and you have some real world evidence from states that have legalized in the United States that violent crime has actually risen instead of falling, as people who promoted legalization said would probably happen. At some point, you have to say to yourself, is this a risk we should be talking about? Even if it's not proven yet, is this a risk that is relevant to legalization? And to my mind, that question is definitely yes. The answer is yes.
So, the perception is that if you smoke a joint, you get dopey, you get the munchies, you want to go to bed, you laugh at other people's jokes. It's certainly not that you grab a knife and stab somebody.
Sure. So this is in the context of somebody who's having a psychotic episode that might have lasted days or weeks in some cases, where people are becoming steadily more paranoid. This is not somebody who's smoking a joint once every 3 months with buddies and laughing at cartoons on the couch. This is somebody who is steadily decompensating, who's having thoughts of, my neighbors are pumping poison gas into my apartment, or my child is a child of the devil, or that police car that drove by once last night and once again this morning is out to get me. I think it's very hard for people who haven't had this problem, or who haven't talked to a lot of people who have had this problem, to understand how painful and difficult these thoughts are and how overwhelming they become. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about psychosis. We're not talking about somebody who had, a couple sort of random anxious thoughts for an hour. This is much, much more than that. That's point A. Point B is, we all know alcohol can drive violence. Anybody who's been in a bar at 9 p.m. and gone back at 2 a.m. knows that alcohol can disinhibit people, and sometimes it can cause fights. Or it can cause people who would have had a verbal argument to instead start throwing punches, or people who would have been throwing punches to instead pick up a bottle. Alcohol escalates and disinhibits. And yet, many, many people use alcohol every day and don't wind up hurting other people. They have a drink at dinner and it's fine. And some people drink pretty heavily and just pass out on their couch. So we all know this is true about alcohol. We know alcohol can cause violence, and yet doesn't cause violence most of the time it's used. I don't understand why people couldn't have the same realization about cannabis, that for many people, most of the time, it can be a drug that, it's pleasurable or it just knocks you out. And yet for some people, some of the time can have these very negative effects.
Well, that's one of the arguments for legalization is, look, alcohol's legal, why don't we treat them the same?
It certainly is. And to me, in some ways, it's the best argument for legalization. But that doesn't mean it's a good argument. Alcohol causes a lot of mortality and morbidity in our society, even though most people can use it in a healthy way most of the time. Even assuming that cannabis is no worse than alcohol overall, and I would say it's clearly more psychiatrically harmful, less physically harmful, more psychiatrically harmful, and can be more quickly harmful to some people. Even let's say it's not more dangerous than alcohol. Alcohol causes a lot of problems. Do we want another drug to be legal that might cause similar problems? And that's a decision each person has to make for him or herself in the voting booth. But what's frustrating to me right now is somebody who, I come at this, I would say from a public health perspective, even though I'm not an epidemiologist or a scientist, but I'm trying to think about it from a public health perspective, is that the argument is being made essentially from propaganda and lies from the cannabis community. They won't talk about these risks honestly, and so it's difficult for people to make an honest, informed decision.
I guess in fairness, some advocates in New Zealand will admit the harms of marijuana, but they say that legalization means you bring it out to the open and people can get help.
There's not much evidence of that, unfortunately, from the legalized states either. Use was pretty high in the US in those states pre-legalization. It's remained high and it's actually risen quite a bit, especially in young adults. There remains an illicit market in states that have legalized, believe it or not, because anytime there's regulation and taxes, there are going to be some people who want the lowest priced product, and that tends to be the illicit product. And so what you get in states that have legalized is you get companies that market aggressively with billboards, promoting the use of cannabis for anxiety, depression, having stores that might attract people who wouldn't be willing to buy on the illicit market. So you have a growth in use, plus you have the illicit market. You sort of have the worst of both worlds.
So one of the arguments by cannabis advocates here is that we can regulate it. In other words, we can limit the THC, we can limit where it's sold, we can make age restrictions, we can limit advertising, we can control the industry. Are they in la-la land?
Yes, pretty much. It's much the same problem. Certainly when you try to limit potency, there are going to be users who want high potency product. If that's not available to them in legal stores, they're going to continue to buy it on the illicit market. I suppose theoretically you could limit marketing. Now the history in the US, not just of cannabis, but of alcohol, is of regulatory capture, of companies that become powerful and push back on regulations. Spirits didn't used to be advertised on television in the US, now they are. About the only industry that's been an exception to that is tobacco, because the public revulsion around tobacco is so strong that those companies can't really market their product. And guess what? Tobacco use has fallen in the United States for the last 30 or 40 years. So when you allow marketing and advertising, the market grows. I mean, I don't understand why anybody would even question that. Marketing and advertising, those people are very good at what they do, whether they're selling cereal or cars or an addictive drug.
So, I mean, coming to New Zealand for the first time, do you find it slightly ironic that we want to be this great country that goes smoke-free in 2025?
I do. I think... I think people should read a little bit about the history of the tobacco companies and ask themselves what they're seeing in the US from legal cannabis companies.
But can we get it right this time? I mean, clearly we lost control of the tobacco industry. They sucked us in, literally and figuratively.
Yes.
And we've paid the cost ever since. It's been a public health disaster.
Yes.
We're finally booting them out. Can we invite the cannabis lobby in but control them?
I don't know how that's possible. I mean, I guess theoretically you could have sort of state-run cannabis stores selling drab products from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. 3 days a week.
Limited THC.
Yeah, limited THC. that's fine. There'll still be a huge illicit market in that case.
And well, that's right. Doesn't, as soon as you put restrictions on, doesn't that just immediately empower the black market again?
Yes, it absolutely does. That is clearly the experience in the legalized states. In the U.S., states have gone one of two ways. They've either allowed essentially a pretty open market where almost anybody can grow and it's pretty easy to open stores. That's been the experience in Oregon. And guess what happens? In that case, you have very little friction. And this product is called weed for a reason. It's very easy to grow. It's very cheap. Prices tend towards zero. And in fact, in Oregon right now, you can get an ounce of pretty decent legalized cannabis for about $35 US, which makes it, as far as I can tell, the cheapest intoxicant in the history of the world. So that's choice A, cheap price, wide availability, lots of use. Choice B is to go the California and Massachusetts model. You have pretty tight restrictions. It's kind of hard to open dispensaries, lots of regulations. Guess what? Prices are high and the illicit market remains very strong in those states. And then there's one other factor that follows that, which is the legalized companies can't really compete. So they do two things. They actually push for police enforcement against the illicit market. And at the same time, they advertise their product to naive consumers who may not know what the product is, quote unquote, supposed to cost. So the only way they can compete is by growing the market with new users. And great, so you have a strong black market and you have companies whose only choice is to try to grow the market.
So one of the other arguments used by advocates is that, look, it's not a criminal issue. We shouldn't be locking up people. It shouldn't be illegal. It's a health issue. People really just want treatment.
So yes, there's sort of three untruths in there to unpack. The first is how many people are incarcerated for cannabis possession and or use. And in the US, the number's almost nil.
Yeah, it's minimal here.
People do get arrested for cannabis possession. And if they're even taken in, they're almost always released immediately. You have to traffic a lot of cannabis, I mean hundreds of pounds in the US most of the time before you're facing any kind of significant prison time. You have to be a real serious drug dealer. The second half of that is, do people want treatment? Sure, some people want treatment. Drug courts are also a good way to encourage people who might have a problem with cannabis or other drugs into treatment. And when you remove that weapon from the police and the judicial system, when there's no risk of arrest, you make it actually harder in some cases to convince people that they need treatment.
Do people want treatment? I mean, some people just want to get high, don't they?
So it's an interesting question. Cannabis, look, all drug users, some people don't want treatment at all, even if their problems are
recreational.
Even if they know they're messing up their lives, sometimes people don't want treatment. With cannabis, it's actually quite interesting because in the US, the number of people in treatment for cannabis addiction has actually gone down in the last few years. But the reason for that is because of this decriminalization and legalization, drug courts haven't been able to send people into treatment. If you look at the number of people who enter treatment voluntarily for cannabis, that number actually appears to have risen. So what's happening is, for many people, they're actually seeing that this drug is a problem for them and that they have a very hard time cutting back on their use. One of the words that psychiatrists often use to describe cannabis and cannabis addiction is insidious, in that people, because it's not alcohol, because you don't wake up with a hangover every day, and because it's not heroin and it doesn't have a huge social stigma attached to it, people will wind up using lots of this drug and their lives will sort of slowly deteriorate. They'll slowly begin to have problems with their spouse, with their work, with their children. And yet they won't necessarily attribute that problem to cannabis. And then one day when something really bad happens, their wife says to them, you need to stop using this drug or I'm going to leave, or you need to stop using this drug or you're going to be fired. They can't do it. And that's when they say to themselves, holy mackerel, I'm actually addicted to this. I didn't think I could be addicted. Everyone says cannabis is not addictive, but I can't stop using this. I have some kind of dependence here that's a real problem. And they wind up putting themselves into treatment. If we can get them there a little more quickly than that, maybe with the help of a drug court, everyone will be better off.
But they would argue that legalization will help them get that help quicker.
Well, again, you can ask for treatment of cannabis or any drug, whether or not it's legal. The legal status doesn't really change that.
Right. The other key argument being used, especially in New Zealand, but I know it has been internationally as well, is the social justice issue, in that the law unfairly discriminates against well, in New Zealand, it's Pacific Islander Maori. For you, it's the black African American.
Yes.
So, is there any improvement in the situation by legalizing?
It doesn't appear so. So it is definitely true that more black people than white people relative to use get arrested for cannabis use. And there are reasons for that, but there also does appear to be some racial disparity there.
But is that because they use it more or because the police pick on them more?
Well, so it's hard to know. More black people than white people have problematic cannabis use if you believe the US statistics. And it's also true that, in minority neighborhoods, in poorer neighborhoods, there is some older people appear to dislike public cannabis use, and they will call the police and ask for these kids to get rousted or arrested because they view it as a sign of further trouble down the road. So that may be true, and it may also be true that that the cops are just more likely to pick up a young black man than a young white man. I don't know, and I don't think anybody can separate out those factors completely. However, it's also true, and this is the part that the legalizers never talk about, not only that almost effectively nobody, winds up in prison, it's also true that the justice system in the United States, I can't speak to New Zealand, would run pretty much as it does if there were not one arrest made for cannabis post-legalization. One other final point I'd make about this is alcohol's legal, right? We'll come back to that. There are many, many arrests made for alcohol-related crime in the United States: public intoxication, driving under the influence, underage consumption. Those crimes do not go away because the substance is legalized, and those crimes would be subject to arrest even if cannabis were legalized. So somehow, the social justice argument, it's like, if we legalize cannabis, all this stuff will end overnight, every disparity will disappear overnight. There's no evidence from the states that have legalized that that's true.
Because in New Zealand, if you look in communities, the alcohol and the pokey industry have targeted probably the poorest areas,
yes,
the people who are least likely to be able to afford it, most vulnerable. Is that what the
pot
industry going to do?
Well, that has absolutely been the U.S. experience with alcohol and tobacco. I think it's a little early to say that the cannabis industry has specifically targeted African Americans, but it would be stunning if that didn't happen.
Alex, it could also be argued that, if people are going to use drugs, we'd rather they smoke cannabis than they get into meth and synthetic drugs and cocaine and heroin.
I think that's true. The problem is that use of cannabis appears to be a gateway for some people, not for everybody, but for some people, to the use of other drugs. And that's not just because if you buy on the illicit market, your friendly dealer might have those other drugs. There appear to be pharmacological priming effects where using cannabis opens up your brain, sensitizes your brain possibly to the use of other drugs. And honestly, I think there are cultural priming effects. That is, when drug use becomes more normalized in a society, the use of all drugs is likely to go up. People are likely to experiment, and the notion that, hey, you know what, I'm just going to try this one time and it'll be fine, what's the worst that can happen? For cannabis or alcohol, there's some danger there. For a drug like cocaine or heroin, there's significant danger there.
And the other selling point is that we're just going to completely explode in tax revenue from selling all this cannabis.
That's clear.
And it's going to pay for schools and roads and every other health issue.
That's clearly untrue. So in Colorado and Washington, which are the states that have the highest revenue, cannabis is about maybe a bit more than 1% of the state budget. And by the way, this is the state budget, not the federal budget, because once again, you have this issue: if you tax it too much, sales just stay on the illicit market.
One commentator in New Zealand, a journalist, said that you've cherry-picked, selectively massaged the evidence, that it's alarmism, it's an inaccurate misreading of science.
So the only part of that that's true is that I am alarmist. I think people should be alarmed about this. I think the growing use of an addictive, dangerous drug is something that should concern us from a public health point of view. As for cherry picking, I bought the whole orchard. All the science basically lines up the same way. I'm pretty careful in saying, here's what we know, here's where we think we know, but we don't quite know yet, and here's where I'm being a little bit more speculative. And in terms of whether the book is accurate or not, The book is accurate, and here's how I can tell you that for certain. It's been vetted by the people who hate it the most, who've pored over it, looking at every study I mentioned, seeing if I'm reporting the results accurately, and they haven't been able to find basically any errors in it. And I'm happy to tell you that I now have a full bibliography that has 170 sources, including more than 100 that are peer-reviewed studies or government documents. So that's true primary research. The book is accurate. You can dislike what it says, but you can't dispute the facts.
Well, yeah, and that's what I was going to ask. It's been attacked by lots of people, lots of groups, and media hate it. But do they hate it because they can't find a weakness, they don't like what you're saying, or because they think you've got it wrong?
No, they hate it because they hate the book because it's strong, not because it's weak. If I had made stuff up, nobody would have paid any attention to it, and it would have been gone in a week. It's because the science is rock solid, and I've presented it in a way that people can understand that the book has its power. And what's interesting to me is the media in the U.S. have, they've shut me out, not entirely, but they've shut me out considerably, considering that I was a reporter for the New York Times. I would have expected the book to get more review attention, that I'd be on morning shows in the US, that maybe someplace like 60 Minutes would have done an episode on it. None of that has happened. And yet word about the book continues to spread. And it does that because the book resonates with the experiences that people have had and families have had around this drug. And it says to them, this is real. This is a real problem. You're not some unlucky person whose son got a 1 in a million, a problem with psychosis after using. This is relatively widespread. And that's why the book has its power, even though the media has done its best to ignore it.
So, they would quote the open letter signed by 75 academics and medical professionals who say the book's irresponsible and dangerous.
So I would advise anybody who believes that to actually look at the signers. And it's funny you say academics and medical professionals. These are almost all social scientists.
Also, some people from NORML and from the Drug Policy Alliance as well.
That's correct. I believe there are 2 psychiatrists and fewer than 10 MDs. And almost all those people have some pre-existing connection to the cannabis industry, or in many cases, a financial stake in the cannabis industry. The psychiatrists, the emergency room doctors, the addiction specialists, the people who deal with this up front, I can't tell you how many of them have emailed me and said, thank you for talking about this. The problem is, and to my mind, they've sort of failed a little bit. They should be speaking publicly. People with MDs behind their name, when they talk, they're listened to. But because the cannabis legalizers have done such a good job smearing anybody, look, if you're a doctor, you've got patients to see. If you're a scientist, you've got research to do. You don't want to get in fights on Twitter that waste all your time. For me, I'm a journalist. I can talk about the failures of journalism here and then tell you what the scientists have said. And I don't mind fighting with people on Twitter.
Well, in your defense, more than 40 clinicians, researchers and scientists from Massachusetts, including many from Harvard Medical School, said that, no, there is a concern. It wasn't specifically about your book, but about the higher THC.
Yes.
So
those are the people we want to be listening to, not some sociologist who thinks that the police arrest too many people of color. Like, that may or may not be true, but it has nothing to do with the argument about whether cannabis is harmful.
It seems like we're not talking about Woodstock weed or your parents' pot anymore. Is part of the problem that we truly don't understand here in New Zealand, especially just how potent the cannabis pot, whatever you call it, dope, is going to be that comes to New Zealand.
Yes, it is a different drug. It really is. It's about 15 to 30 times as strong as it was in the late 60s. It's about 4 to 5 times as strong as it was in the 1990s.
And so that's going to increase the mental effect.
You're using more THC. The exposure to any drug, whether it's heroin, cocaine, alcohol, the more you use and the more quickly you use, the more potential for dependence there is, and the more potential for side effects there is. It's a different drug.
But do you have to have that disposition towards those conditions, or is it?
That's a really good question, and I think we're still working towards an answer on that. Clearly, there are people out there who are predisposed to become severely mentally ill. Essentially, they have genetic loading, and those people really shouldn't use cannabis. But what seems to be happening in the US is that there are some people, and I'm not going to say there are many, but there are some people, if you use a lot of this drug for a long time, whether it's because you're addicted or maybe you have some minor mental illness like anxiety that you're trying to treat with this instead of, going to a doctor, you're trying to self-medicate. People who use a lot of cannabis for a long period of time, some of those people are suddenly having psychotic breaks, even if they were outside the normal window for developing psychotic illness. And that's actually quite scary because it suggests that even if you don't have much of a risk, if you really tax your mind with THC for a long period of time, you might have severe mental illness. Again, I'm not going to tell you that's common, but it's happened enough times that it's something we should know about.
So the suggestion is that we can regulate it and we can keep the THC down to a manageable level so it doesn't harm people as much. Have we just empowered the black market by doing that?
Yes, absolutely. You can't, and by the way, you can't regulate biology. These risks are what they are. So all we're saying is, on the one hand, we're exposing a bunch of people to a dangerous addictive drug, and we're hoping that not that many of them will have severe consequences. On the other hand, yes, there's an illicit market. Yes, there are these consequences for people who are arrested using it. We'd like those to go away by legalizing. To me, the risks of legalization outweigh the benefits.
One of the regulations that they've proposed is that up to 14 grams can be carried on you at any 24-hour period. So they estimated that it was somewhere around you could purchase 20 to 40 joints each day.
Yes.
That's pretty generous, isn't it?
This is you laugh, but this is a drug that heavy users develop a tolerance to that's hard to imagine. So the normal breakdown for somebody who's a naive user of cannabis, who's not a user, is if you go into a dispensary in the US, if you go into a cannabis shop in the US and you say, I want to just get a little high, I'm not a user, I want to get a little high. They'll say, well, 2.5 milligrams of THC is like one drink. So try 5 milligrams, that's 2 drinks for you. People who use this drug heavily, I've heard from people who use 500 milligrams a day, 1 gram a day, that's 1,000 milligrams. So you can't imagine that would be 400 alcoholic drinks in a day. That would kill anybody. People develop a really huge tolerance to this drug, and that's one reason why they push so hard for legalization. When your habit reaches that amount, you need a cheap, steady, available supply, and you don't really care about what the harms might be. So one way to think about legalization is we're going to make it easier for people who have a problem with this drug to have a problem with this drug more cheaply and openly.
Wasn't it one of your colleagues from the New York Times that...
Maureen Dowd, yes. She had a panic attack after eating an edible. Yes.
Brownie.
Yes.
That's right. And she was a supporter of legalization,
she
wasn't she?
And it's a very interesting thing. I don't talk that much about this, but but I'm glad you raised it. People mocked her. Oh, she's a loser. She couldn't hold the equivalent of she couldn't hold her liquor. She couldn't hold her cannabis.
She basically had a psychotic episode on the hotel floor for a couple of hours.
That's correct. And
From one brownie.
Now, there was a fair amount of THC in there, although not that much.
But the problem is you don't realize it's hitting you until after.
Until it's too late.
Yeah.
But what I think is really, again, what's really interesting about this is what did we do? We mocked her. So the industry has gotten so good at downplaying the side effects here that it's like, oh, she's just an old lady who didn't know what she was doing. And I'm shocked by how many times I hear from people who've had a bad experience around the drug, and they're like, I didn't want to tell my friends because I'm just the loser who couldn't figure out how much of an edible to eat. And it's like, actually, it's not you, it's the drug. But we've made it about the user and mocked the user. And again, imagine doing that with any other drug. Imagine saying to the person who had a problem, with alcohol, oh, you're just a loser who drank too much. You should just get back on the horse and try it again tomorrow. That's not what most people over the age of 22 would say. They'd say, maybe you have a problem with alcohol. Maybe you should stay away from it for a while. There's a cult around cannabis that doesn't exist around alcohol or any other drug. People who promote it almost rabidly. And I don't quite understand it.
You never majored in this topic. I mean, you've written 12 novels.
Yes.
You've covered Iraq and Hurricane Katrina as a journalist. Why did you get into this? I mean, what made you write a book on this issue?
Because it's a failure of journalism in the media. And that's something that I feel like I do have some expertise on. I was a reporter at the New York Times for more than 10 years. And it's like, imagine you were a doctor and you saw another doctor committing malpractice, or you were a pastor and you saw another pastor, sleeping with his congregation. You'd be especially upset, because that to you, I would think, it would violate your own professional ethics as well as your personal ethics. And to me, seeing journalism's failure here is especially galling, because there's an old line in journalism: if your mother says she loves you, check it out. We're supposed to be the skeptics. We're supposed to be the ones who ask the hard questions of people. And to see people in my business, as an opioid epidemic is going on, as tobacco has killed literally tens of millions of people worldwide, to see them lapping up the propaganda that the cannabis industry is offering just galls me. I gotta be honest, it just upsets me as a reporter.
So as New Zealanders think about whether they tick yes or no in the referendum on legalising cannabis, what's your word to them?
I'd vote no. I don't think the world needs a third major legalized drug. We have enough problems with the two that we have right now. If you want to vote yes, and I understand there are reasons why, but go in with your eyes open. Don't think crime will go down, it won't. Don't think mental health will be helped, it won't. Don't think there'll be a lot of taxes from this. There'll be some, but they'll probably be outweighed by the extra cost. Don't think the roads will be safer, they won't. Don't think the cops will have less to do, they won't. And don't think that you'll be able to avoid your kids getting involved, because they are as susceptible to marketing as everybody else's kids.
And don't think the gangs will be out of business?
And don't think the gangs will be out of business either, because, again, there will be an illicit market in this drug.
And can I just ask, will we stop at legalising cannabis, or is there more on the agenda?
For the people who are pro-legalization, there's certainly more on the agenda. In the US, a couple of the states where cannabis has been legalized, there's already a move to legalize psychedelics, drugs like LSD, mescaline, mushrooms. And ultimately, I think the drug lobby, they call themselves drug reformers, but really they're lobbyists for drug use. They want the decriminalization, at least, of all drugs, including cocaine and heroin.
Methamphetamine.
Methamphetamine too, yes.
Do they want to legalise?
What's that?
Do they want to legalise?
Only the most radical of them will publicly disclose that as a goal right now. But even decriminalization of a drug like methamphetamine and the increased use that would likely result would be a public health disaster.
Alex, good to have you in New Zealand. Thanks for coming.
Bob, thank you so much. And I have to say, I've seen the polls that show that legalization is not nearly as popular here as it is in the US. And I think the ads that you've run, you've really found a way to message this. And I hope that in the US we take up some of your campaigns, because they do seem very successful. And I hope people are listening. It looks like people are listening.